At 18, Olivia Parker owned exactly one backpack, $73, and a letter informing her that she had officially aged out of foster care. By sunset, she would have nowhere to sleep, no family was waiting for her, no apartment had been prepared, no one even knew where she would go next. Then a lawyer called with news that sounded almost like a mistake. A great-grandmother Olivia had never met had left her an abandoned apple orchard on the edge of a small country town. "Don't get your hopes up," the lawyer warned. "The trees haven't been cared for in years. The cottage is falling apart, and everyone expects you'll sell it." Even the first neighbor she met told her the same thing. "Take the money and leave. That orchard died a long time ago." But while cleaning a dusty bedroom inside the tiny cottage, Olivia discovered a weathered journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Most of its pages described pruning trees, planting seasons, and harvests from decades ago. Then, near the end, one sentence appeared again and again in careful handwriting. "If you found this journal, don't waste your time searching for treasure. Find the room." 3 weeks later, after following every clue her great-grandmother had left behind, Olivia uncovered something hidden beneath the old orchard that had remained untouched for generations, and she realized the orchard itself had never been the true inheritance. At 18, Olivia Parker learned that becoming an adult did not always mean becoming independent. Sometimes it simply meant that the system responsible for raising you stopped calling your name. On her final morning at the foster care residence, everything she owned fit neatly into a faded blue backpack. 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, an old notebook she had carried since middle school, and $73 folded inside her wallet. Mrs. Dawson, the social worker who had known Olivia for nearly 6 years, hugged her tightly before handing over a small envelope containing her official documents. "You've always found a way to keep going," she said softly. "Don't stop believing that." Olivia smiled, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. By noon, she was standing outside the building with no address to write on future forms, and no one expecting her anywhere. She spent the afternoon walking through the city, stopping only long enough to buy a sandwich and charge her phone at a public library. She searched online for jobs that included employee housing, but every listing required experience she didn't have or interviews scheduled weeks away. As the sun began to sink, she found herself sitting alone at a bus station, trying to decide whether to spend nearly half of her remaining money on a motel room or save it for food. Just then, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Olivia Parker?" a calm voice asked after she answered. "Yes?" "My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm an attorney with Lawson & Grant. I'm calling regarding the estate of Martha Parker." Olivia frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't know anyone named Martha Parker." "According to our records," the lawyer replied gently, "Martha Parker was your great-grandmother. She passed away several weeks ago and named you as the beneficiary of her property." Olivia sat silently for a moment. She had grown up knowing almost nothing about her biological family. Hearing that someone related to her had remembered her at all felt unreal. "What kind of property?" she finally asked. "An old apple orchard outside the town of Willow Creek. The estate contains a small cottage and the surrounding land." The next morning, Olivia boarded the first bus she could afford. The journey took nearly 3 hours before the road narrowed into quiet countryside lined with fields and rolling hills. Rebecca met her at a small law office and handed her a ring holding 2 old brass keys along with the property documents. "The orchard hasn't been maintained for years," she explained. "Several local buyers have expressed interest in purchasing it if you decide to sell." Olivia thanked her and followed the directions toward the property. The orchard appeared at the end of a gravel lane bordered by neglected fences. Hundreds of apple trees stretched across the hillside, their branches wild from years without pruning. Weeds covered the pathways, and many of the wooden fences leaned at awkward angles. Near the center stood a weathered white cottage with chipped paint and a sagging porch. As Olivia climbed the front steps, an older pickup truck stopped near the gate. A gray-haired man leaned out the window. "You must be Martha's granddaughter." "Great-granddaughter," Olivia corrected politely. The man nodded. "Name's Henry Collins. My advice, sell the place while you can. That orchard's been dying for years." Olivia thanked him, unlocked the cottage, and stepped inside. Dust coated every surface, but the house still felt strangely welcoming. While opening old windows to let fresh air inside, she noticed one loose floorboard beneath a small writing desk in the bedroom. Curious, she knelt and carefully lifted it. Hidden underneath lay a weathered leather journal wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. Across the front cover, written in careful handwriting, were 4 simple words: "For whoever comes home." Olivia carried the weathered journal into the cottage kitchen, where the late afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows and settled across the old wooden table. She carefully untied the faded cloth wrapped around it before opening the cracked leather cover. The first pages were filled with neat handwriting that had barely faded despite the passing years. Martha Parker had written about spring blossoms, pruning schedules, rainfall, and harvest seasons with remarkable detail. Every tree in the orchard seemed to have its own story. Olivia smiled quietly. She had never cared for an orchard before, yet she found herself reading every page as though listening to someone speaking directly to her. That evening, she swept the kitchen floor, opened every window to let fresh air inside, and gathered broken branches from the porch. The cottage was old but sturdy. For the first time since leaving foster care, she would sleep beneath a roof that belonged to no one else. The following morning, she stepped outside carrying the journal. Henry Collins was already repairing a fence along the neighboring field. Seeing Olivia, he walked over slowly, removing his work gloves. "You stayed," he said with a faint smile. Olivia nodded. "At least for now." Henry looked across the neglected orchard. "Your great-grandmother loved these trees more than anything. She knew every one of them." Olivia showed him the journal. Henry's eyes softened immediately. Martha carried that book everywhere. Every planting season, every harvest, she'd write something before going inside. As they walked between the rows of overgrown apple trees, Henry pointed out the oldest sections of the orchard and shared stories Olivia had never heard. Martha had planted many of the trees herself decades earlier and refused to cut down even the weakest ones until she was certain they could no longer recover. "She always believed an old tree deserved one more chance," Henry said. Back inside the cottage that afternoon, Olivia continued reading. Most entries focused on caring for the orchard, but every dozen pages or so, Martha repeated the same unusual sentence: "The orchard always remembers." Olivia frowned. The words appeared too often to be accidental. Some entries circled the phrase, others underlined it twice. Near the back of the journal, she found several pages written in much smaller handwriting, almost as though Martha had wanted to hide them among the ordinary notes. Unsure what some of the older expressions meant, Olivia carried the journal into Willow Creek's small public library. Emma Reed, the town librarian, welcomed her warmly after hearing she had inherited the Parker orchard. Together, they studied the journal for nearly an hour. Emma explained a few old farming terms and smiled at Martha's careful observations. But when they reached the repeated sentence, she paused. "This doesn't sound like ordinary gardening advice," she admitted. It feels more like she's trying to leave someone a message. Olivia slowly turned another page. A pressed apple blossom slipped onto the table. Beneath it, written in darker ink than the surrounding entries, was a single instruction that had never appeared before. "If you wish to understand the orchard," Martha had written, "follow the oldest tree." Early the next morning, Olivia carried Martha's journal into the orchard before the summer sun had fully risen above the hills. Dew still covered the tall grass between the rows of neglected apple trees, and birds filled the quiet air with cheerful songs that seemed strangely out of place in an orchard everyone insisted was dying. She stopped every few minutes to compare the trees around her with the descriptions written in the journal. Martha had recorded planting dates, harvests, and even small details about unusual branches. But one entry stood out more than the others. "The oldest tree has watched every season. Begin there." Olivia followed the narrow path toward the highest part of the property where the oldest trees had been planted generations earlier. Most were larger than the rest, their trunks twisted by decades of wind and weather. After nearly half an hour, she found one that matched Martha's description exactly. Its massive trunk divided into two thick branches only a few feet above the ground, and an old lightning scar stretched along one side of the bark. Olivia gently placed her hand against the rough surface. Despite its age, the tree was still alive. Fresh green leaves covered its branches, and several small apples were already beginning to grow. As she walked around the trunk, something caught her attention. Faint marks had been carved into the bark many years before. They were not names or dates, but simple symbols, small circles connected by short lines. Olivia immediately recognized the careful style. It looked remarkably similar to the handwriting and sketches inside Martha's journal. She copied the symbols into her notebook before searching the surrounding ground for anything else. Henry arrived a short time later carrying pruning tools. When Olivia showed him the carvings, he removed his hat and studied them quietly. "I remember Martha standing here with a measuring tape," he said after a long pause. "She'd measure from this tree to several others every spring. I asked why once, but she only smiled and said she was making sure the orchard never forgot its way home." Olivia smiled at the familiar phrase, "The orchard always remembers." Henry nodded. "She said that often." Curious. Olivia turned back to the journal and carefully examined the pages surrounding the note about the oldest tree. As she slowly separated two sheets that had stuck together with age, a thin folded paper slipped into her lap. It was no larger than a postcard, and had clearly been hidden inside the journal on purpose. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map of the orchard, showing only a handful of the oldest trees. Small circles marked their positions, connected by straight lines matching the symbols carved into the trunk. Excited, Olivia compared the map with the orchard around her. The lines seemed to point somewhere important. She followed them with her finger until they all met at a single location. Her excitement faded into surprise. The destination was not another tree. Every line ended at the small cottage standing quietly in the middle of the orchard. Olivia hurried back to the cottage with the folded map still clutched in her hand. Standing outside, she looked from the paper to the small white house at the center of the orchard. Every line connecting the oldest trees ended here. Martha had spent years measuring the orchard, yet all the paths led back to the place where she had lived. Olivia unlocked the front door and slowly walked inside. The cottage felt quieter than before, as though she had crossed into it with new eyes. Instead of seeing an old house in need of repair, she now wondered whether every room concealed another clue. She began with the bedroom where she had found the journal beneath the loose floorboard. This time she checked every board, every wall, and every piece of furniture. Nothing seemed unusual. The tiny kitchen revealed only worn cupboards and shelves lined with old preserving jars. Even the attic contained little more than faded blankets, broken baskets, and empty crates. After nearly 2 hours of searching, Olivia sat down at the kitchen table, frustrated. "If the map leads here," she whispered to herself, "what am I missing?" That afternoon, Luke Harris stopped by in his pickup truck. He owned the large orchard bordering Martha's property and had already heard that Olivia intended to stay. Leaning against the porch railing, he looked across the neglected rows of apple trees. "You're working hard," he admitted. "But keeping an orchard alive isn't easy. You could sell the place now and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else." Olivia thanked him politely, but shook her head. "I'd like to understand why my great-grandmother wanted me here before I decide anything." Luke smiled kindly. "Fair enough. Just don't wait too long." After he left, Olivia carried the map to the Willow Creek Library. Emma spread both the journal and the hand-drawn map across a large reading table beneath the afternoon light. For nearly an hour, they compared the symbols carved into the oldest tree with the markings on the paper. Emma suddenly noticed something Olivia had overlooked. "Look at these corners," she said, pointing toward the edges of the map. "These aren't tree symbols. They're floor measurements." Olivia looked closer. The shape outlined on the map matched the cottage itself. The circles marking the oldest trees weren't simply directions. They aligned perfectly with the walls inside the house. Excited, the two women returned to the orchard before sunset. Emma carefully counted the distances shown on the map, while Olivia measured the cottage floor one room at a time. Every line eventually crossed at the same point in the small sitting room beside the fireplace. They moved the worn rug aside and knelt on the wooden floor. Most of the square tiles looked identical, faded by decades of use. Then Olivia noticed one near the center that carried a tiny carved symbol, almost hidden beneath layers of old varnish. It was the same circle and line marking she had copied from the oldest apple tree. She gently brushed away the dust with her fingertips, realizing that after following the orchard's clues back to the cottage, Martha had left the next answer waiting beneath a single marked floor tile. Olivia knelt beside the marked floor tile while Emma held the map open beside her. The tiny symbol carved into the wood matched the one on the oldest apple tree perfectly. It was so faint that years of dust and worn varnish had nearly erased it. "Your great-grandmother wanted someone to notice this," Emma said quietly. Olivia nodded and fetched a small screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Working carefully, she loosened the thin strip of wood surrounding the tile before lifting it free. Neither of them spoke as they peered into the narrow opening beneath the floor. There was no hidden staircase or underground room waiting below. Instead, only a small wooden compartment had been built between the floor beams. Inside rested a rusted iron key attached to a faded leather cord and a folded piece of paper protected inside waxed cloth. Olivia carefully lifted both items into the light. The key was old, heavier than an ordinary house key, with an unusual rounded handle engraved with the same orchard symbol. She unfolded the note with trembling hands. Martha's handwriting appeared immediately. The message was surprisingly short. "Not here," it read. "Below." Olivia frowned. "Below what?" Emma looked around the quiet room. "It can't mean this compartment. We've already found that." Olivia studied the key more closely. It showed no sign of recent use, yet Martha had taken great care to keep it dry and protected. Whatever it unlocked had clearly been important. Henry arrived later that afternoon, after seeing the cottage windows open. Olivia showed him both the hidden compartment and Martha's note. He smiled softly, impressed that she had followed the clues this far. Martha, always believed the best things were worth searching for, he said, catching himself after confusing old memories with familiar names. He turned the heavy key over in his weathered hands. I've never seen this before. Together they searched the cottage once again, trying every visible lock. The key fit none of them. It was too large for the front door, too old for the kitchen cabinets, and completely different from the locks on the attic trunk. Even the shed outside used a newer key. As evening settled over the orchard, Olivia placed the mysterious key beside Martha's journal on the kitchen table. Every clue so far had led exactly where the journal promised, yet the final instruction only deepened the mystery. Not here, below. Emma quietly folded the map. She wanted you to understand that this compartment wasn't the destination. Olivia looked around the little cottage once more. Somewhere beneath the house, or perhaps beneath something inside it, the real secret was still waiting. She gently closed the journal, knowing the search was far from over. The note rested on the kitchen table long after Emma had returned to town. Olivia read its 2 short lines over and over. Not here. Below. The words were simple, yet every place she searched beneath the floor had led nowhere except the hidden compartment. She picked up the heavy iron key again, turning it slowly beneath the lamp. The rounded handle carried the familiar orchard symbol, but there was nothing to suggest what it unlocked. Outside, evening settled quietly over the neglected rows of apple trees. Henry stopped by the following morning carrying a basket of fresh bread and apples from his own small orchard. Olivia showed him the key once more, hoping something about it would seem familiar. Henry studied it for a long moment before his eyes drifted toward the old stone fireplace in the sitting room. You know, he said thoughtfully, about 15 years ago, Martha hired a mason to repair that chimney after a winter storm damaged it. Olivia looked toward the fireplace. Did they rebuild it? Henry nodded slowly. Not completely. Just the lower part. I remember because Martha insisted on supervising every step herself. She wouldn't let anyone work inside the house unless she was standing there watching. That memory stayed with Olivia after Henry left. Later that afternoon, she drove to the Willow Creek Library carrying the journal, the map, and the mysterious key. Emma listened carefully before disappearing into the town archive once again. She returned with a thick folder containing decades-old building permits. I think I found something, she said, spreading a faded blueprint across the table. It showed the original cottage exactly as it had been built many years before Martha's repairs. Olivia immediately noticed a difference. The fireplace extended farther into the house on the old drawing than it did today. During the renovation, part of the stone base had been rebuilt, making the room appear slightly smaller. Emma traced the outline with her finger. According to this permit, the foundation beneath the fireplace was open during construction. Olivia's pulse quickened. So something underneath could have been covered. They hurried back to the orchard before sunset. Henry joined them as Olivia carefully moved the old rocking chair away from the fireplace. The stonework looked ordinary until Henry pointed toward one side where the mortar was slightly lighter than the surrounding bricks. That's the repaired section, he said. Olivia knelt and gently pressed against one loose stone near the hearth. It shifted just enough to reveal a narrow gap behind it. She reached inside and felt cold wood instead of solid stone. Working together, they removed 2 more carefully fitted blocks. Hidden behind them was an old wooden door no wider than a person, its surface almost perfectly concealed by the fireplace for years. A rusted iron lock sat in the center. Olivia slowly lifted the heavy key from her pocket. Without saying a word, she slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. Olivia wrapped both hands around the old iron key and slowly turned it inside the rusted lock. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then a deep metallic click echoed behind the fireplace, followed by the soft groan of old hinges that had not moved in decades. Henry stepped forward and gently pulled the narrow wooden door toward him. Cool air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Olivia raised a lantern from the hearth and shined it through the opening. A narrow stone staircase disappeared beneath the cottage. "Martha never told anyone about this," Henry whispered, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire behind them. Olivia carefully stepped onto the first worn stone stair, while Emma followed close behind. The passage was dry and surprisingly well built. Every step led farther beneath the cottage until the staircase opened into a small underground cellar supported by thick stone walls. Unlike the neglected rooms above, this place had been carefully maintained before it was sealed. Wooden shelves lined every wall, each one covered with neatly arranged boxes, glass jars, and cloth-wrapped bundles. Dust rested on everything, yet nothing appeared damaged. There were no treasure chests overflowing with gold, no stacks of money, and no family jewels hidden away. Instead, every shelf reflected years of quiet care. Olivia walked slowly through the cellar, her lantern revealing handwritten labels attached to dozens of wooden boxes. Each carried the name of an apple variety, followed by a year. Some names were unfamiliar, while others had long disappeared from modern orchards. Nearby stood rows of glass jars sealed with wax, each protecting small cloth packets filled with carefully preserved seeds. Emma gently picked up one of the labels. "These aren't ordinary seeds," she said softly. "Many of these varieties haven't been grown around here for decades." Henry stood silently before another shelf containing thick notebooks arranged in careful order. He opened the nearest volume and immediately recognized Martha's handwriting. Every page recorded years of observations about soil, weather, grafting techniques, and the careful preservation of old fruit trees. "She documented everything," he murmured. Olivia smiled as she looked around the quiet room. This hidden cellar had never been built to protect wealth. It had been built to protect knowledge. Along the far wall stood a large wooden chest. Unlike the others, it carried the orchard symbol carved deeply into its lid. Olivia slowly lifted the heavy top. Inside rested several smaller journals, bundles of handwritten letters, and one carefully wrapped package tied with faded green ribbon. She picked it up gently, realizing that after following every clue Martha had left behind, she was finally holding the last unopened piece of her great-grandmother's remarkable legacy. Olivia carefully untied the faded green ribbon and unfolded the package resting inside the wooden chest. It contained several handwritten letters, the final volume of Martha Parker's journal, and a neatly organized collection of documents describing every seed stored inside the cellar. The first letter was addressed simply, "To the one who chose to stay." Olivia smiled as she recognized the familiar handwriting. Martha wrote that many people believed the orchard's greatest value was the land itself, but they had always been wrong. The true inheritance had been hidden where time, weather, and greed could never destroy it. Every seed, every notebook, and every carefully labeled box represented years spent preserving apple varieties that had gradually disappeared from nearby farms. Martha feared they would be lost forever if someone did not protect them. She had hidden the cellar not because its contents were valuable in money, but because they were priceless in history. Olivia slowly opened the final journal. Unlike the earlier volumes that focused on pruning and harvests, this one explained why Martha had devoted so much of her life to preserving forgotten fruit trees. She believed every old variety carried generations of knowledge, how it survived harsh winters, resisted disease, or adapted to changing weather. Losing those trees meant losing stories that could never be rewritten. Emma quietly examined several of the seed packets. "Some of these varieties exist only in agricultural collections now," she said. "Others may not exist anywhere else." Henry stood silently beside one of the shelves, gently running his hand across the carefully labeled wooden boxes. "She never told me," he whispered. "I thought she was simply keeping old records because she loved the orchard." Olivia looked around the hidden cellar. For the first time since leaving foster care, she understood why Martha had asked someone not to search for treasure. The treasure had been here all along, patiently waiting beneath the cottage. Not wealth for one person, but knowledge that could help many. During the following months, Emma contacted a regional agricultural preservation center, whose researchers eagerly visited the orchard after hearing about Martha's collection. They carefully cataloged every seed, copied every journal, and confirmed that several apple varieties preserved in the cellar had become extremely rare. Rather than removing the collection, they partnered with Olivia to restore the orchard itself, allowing the historic trees to grow where Martha had always intended. Henry spent nearly every weekend helping repair fences, prune neglected branches, and clear years of overgrown weeds. Even Luke Harris returned one afternoon carrying young rootstock trees in the back of his trunk. Smiling sheepishly, he admitted he had been wrong to encourage Olivia to sell. Instead, he offered equipment, advice, and labor to help restore the orchard. Together they planted new trees, grown from the preserved varieties hidden beneath the cottage. By the following spring, fresh blossoms covered branches that many people had believed would never bloom again. Visitors traveled from neighboring towns to see the restored orchard and learn the story of the hidden cellar beneath the little white cottage. Inside the entrance, Olivia placed Martha's weathered journal inside a glass display case, open to the page that read, "The orchard always remembers." Every evening before locking the cottage door, Olivia walked through the rows of growing trees, grateful not only for the orchard she had inherited, but for the home she had finally found. Martha had never left her fortune or riches. She had left something far greater, a place where forgotten things could live again, and where a young woman who once believed she belonged nowhere finally discovered that she had belonged there all along.